Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. In today's video, I'm going to talk about categorizing literature genres. This video is making to complete our third meeting for Introduction to Literature. So to indicate your attendance in my class, don't forget to leave your comments and also questions below. For those who haven't subscribed my channel, subscribe and like, share this video. Now let's start to talk about categorizing literature's genres. Back in ancient Greece, literature was divided into two main categories, tragedy and comedy. Tragedy is kind of sad and also comedy is kind of happiness. Nowadays, the list of possible types and literature genres can seem endless, but it's still possible to narrow down the vast amount of literature available into a few basic groups. The 5 genres of literature students should be familiar with are poetry, drama, prose, nonfictions, and media. Each of these explained in more detail below. You will see some overlap between genres. For example, prose is a broader term that includes both drama and non-fictions. At the end of this article, we will also touch on a couple of narrower but still important literary genres. Let's get started to talk about the first genre of literature, poetry. This is often considered the oldest form of literature. Before writing was invented, all stories were commonly put into some sort of poetic form to make them easier to remember and recite. Poetry today is usually written down but is still sometimes performance. A lot of people think of rhymes and counting syllables and lines when they think of poetry. And some poems certainly follow strict forms, but other types of poetry are so free-formed that they lack any rhymes or common patterns. There are even kinds of poetry that cross genre. They cross genre lines, such as prose poetry. In general, though a text is a poem when it has some sort of matter or rhythms, and when it focuses on the way the syllables, words, and phrases sound when put together. Poems are heavy in imagery and metaphor and are often made up of fragments and phrases rather than complete grammatically correct sentences. And poetry is nearly always written in stanzas and lines, creating a unique look on the page. Poetry, as experienced in the classroom, is usually one of the 3 types. There are the shorter, more modern poems spanning anything from a few lines to a few pages. Often these are collected in books of poems by a single author by a variety of writers. Edgar Allan Poe's The Ravens is one of the most commonly taught poems of this type. Then there are the classical formulaic poems of Shakespeare's time, such as the blank verse and the sonnet. And finally, there are the ancient epic poems transcribed from oral stories, and these long, complex poems resemble novels such as Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey. That's all about the first genre, poetry. Prose. Once you know what poetry is, it's easy to define prose. Prose can be defined as any kinds of written text that isn't poetry, which means drama, discussed below, is technically a type of prose. The most typical varieties of prose are novels and short stories, while other types include letters, diaries, journals, and non-fictions also discussed below. Prose is written in complete sentences and organized in paragraphs, instead of focusing on sound, which is what poetry does. Prose tends to focus on plot and characters. Prose is the type of literature read most often taught in English classrooms. Any novel or short story falls into this category, from Jane Eyre to Twilight, and from A Sound of Thunder to The Crucible. Like poetry, prose is broken down into a large number of other subgenres. Some of these genres revolve around the structure of the text, such as novels, biographies, and memoirs, and others are based on the subject matters like romances, fantasies, and mysteries. Next is drama. Any text meant to be performed rather than read can be considered drama, unless it's a poem meant to be performed, of course. In layman's terms, drama are usually called plays. When written down, the bulk of a drama is dialogue with periodic stage directions such as "he looks away angrily." Of all the genres of literature discussed in this article, drama is the one given the least time in most classrooms, and often when drama is taught, it's only read the same way you may read a novel. Since dramas are meant to be acted out in front of an audience, it's hard to fully appreciate them when looking only at pages of text. Students respond best to drama and grasp their mechanics more fully when exposed to film or theater versions or encouraged to read aloud or act out scenes during class. And next, the dramas most commonly taught in classroom are definitely those written by the bard. Shakespeare's plays are challenging, but rewarding when approached with a little effort and a critical mindset. Popular choices from his repertoire include Hamlet, Taming of the Shrew, and Romeo and Juliet, among others. Other Greek plays are also taught fairly often, especially Sophocles, Antigone, and any good drama unit should include more modern plays for comparison, such as Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman. Or is nonfiction. Poetry and drama both belong to the broader category of fiction. Texts that feature events and characters that have been made up. Then there is nonfiction, a vast category. There is a type of prose and includes many different subgenres. Nonfiction can be creative, such as the personal essay, or factual, such as the scientific papers. Sometimes the purpose of nonfiction is to tell a story, hence the autobiography, but most of the time the purpose is to pass on information and educate the reader about certain facts, ideas, and or issues. Some genres of nonfiction include histories, textbooks, travel books, newspapers, self-help books, and literary criticisms. A full list of nonfiction types will be at least as long as this entire article, but the varieties most often used in the classroom are textbooks, literary criticisms, and essays of various sorts. Most of what students practice writing in the classroom is the nonfiction essay, from factual to personal to persuasive. And nonfiction is often used to support and expand students' understanding of fiction texts. After reading Hamlet, students might read critical articles about the play and historical information about the time period and or the life of Shakespeare. That is, what does nonfiction mean? Now let's move on to the last genre, media. The newest type of literature that has been defined as a distinct genre is media. This categorization was created to encompass the many new and important kinds of text in our society today, such as movies and films, websites, commercial billboards, radio programs. Any work that doesn't exist primarily as a written text can probably be considered media, particularly if it is relies on recently developed technologies. Media literature can serve a wide variety of purposes. Among other things, it can educate, entertain, advertise, and or persuade. More and more educators are coming to recognize the importance of teaching media in the classroom. Students are likely to be exposed to far more of this type of literature than anything else throughout their lives, so it makes sense to teach them how to be critical and active consumers of media. Internet literacy is a growing field. For example, since the skills required to understand and use online information differ in important ways from the skills required to analyze printed information. Teaching media literacy is also a great way to educators to help students become participants in their own culture through lessons and creating their own website or home movies or commercials. Okay, that's all the genres of literatures, but we still have other types of literature. These are far from the only important genres of literature. Here are a few more that are sometimes used in classroom. Oral literatures. The oldest type of literature and the foundation on which culture was built. Now, most oral texts have been written down and are usually taught in the form of epic poems or plays or folk tales. Next is folklore or folk tales or fables. A distinction is often made between regular prose and folklore. Most folk tales were originally oral literatures and are short stories meant to pass on a particular lesson or moral. They often have a timeless quality, dealing with common human concerns that are relevant to us today, while still being products of a very specific culture and time period. Next, and the last is graphics, novels, and comic books. It used to be that most educators saw comic book as the lowest form of literature, not suitable or valuable for children, but times have changed, and many teachers have come to realize that comic books and the more modern graphic novels are both appealing to kids and are a valid forms of literature in their own right. That's all for our videos today. If you have any comments and questions, don't forget to leave your comments below. If you haven't subscribed, again and again, I ask you to subscribe my YouTube channel.